The Trump administration has announced it no longer views China as a currency manipulator, a charge that Beijing rejected from the start. What's behind this decision? Meanwhile, as China breaks new ground in artificial intelligence, how well does it develop and retain some of the most talented minds in the field? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. The Trump administration formally lifted the tag of currency manipulator from around China's neck on Monday, just 2 days before the two nations are expected to sign a Phase 1 trade deal. According to the U.S. Treasury Department, China has made enforceable commitments to refrain from competitive devaluation and not target its exchange rate for competitive purposes. Though some U.S. media describe this as a big concession, China responded that it should never have been branded this way in the first place. So why this latest move, and how does it affect China? Joining me for the discussion from Massachusetts is Professor Ravi Ramamurti, Director of the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University, and here in the Beijing studio, economics Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. Before we go into our discussion, let's first hear how China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has responded to the U.S. decision.
中国本来就不是汇率操纵国。
China has never been a currency manipulator. The latest conclusion the U.S. has made complies with the fact and the international consensus. The conclusion made by the IMF in its latest assessment also shows that the RMB currency rate generally matches the Chinese economy. The IMF conclusion is more evidence that China does not manipulate its currency.
否认了中国是汇率操纵国这种说法。
So let's get down to the discussion. And gentlemen, welcome to The Point. A little bit of background here. Now, this decision by the U.S. Treasury Department to lift China from this currency manipulator status was announced in the Treasury Department's semi-annual report called the Macroeconomic and Foreign Exchange Policies for Major Trading Partners of the United States. And it says that China has a long history of facilitating this kind of policy. And last year, the Treasury determined that under the Section 3004 of the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988, that China was a currency manipulator. But intensive trade and currency negotiations between China and the United States over the last few months resulted in a Phase 1 agreement that requires structural reforms and other changes to China's economic and trade regime in several key areas, including currency and foreign exchange issues. Remember, this is always according to the Treasury Department report. So in this agreement, China has made enforceable commitments to refrain from competitive devaluation and not target its exchange rate for competitive purposes. China has also agreed to establish relevant information, to publish relevant information related to exchange rates and external balances. Meanwhile, after depreciating as far as 7.18 renminbi per US dollar in early September, the renminbi subsequently appreciated in October and is currently trading at about 6.93 renminbi per dollar. So in this context, the Treasury Department has determined that China should no longer be designated a currency manipulator at this time. So Professor Ramamurti, should China be celebrating?
Well, I mean, I think this is certainly a good thing to have this thing off your back, but it doesn't materially change the outlook for negotiation between the two countries, and it doesn't really take away any of the leverage that President Trump may be able to use in the next phase of negotiations. So I think it's mostly a symbolic gesture, but it doesn't really have great significance in terms of future negotiations.
Professor Gong, from the Chinese perspective, is quite ironic, right? This currency manipulator is like a tag. Here you go. Okay, here it comes off. How do you look at the Chinese perspective here?
Well, I think what the spokesman from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs put it very rightly, that China shouldn't be labeled as a currency manipulator in the first place. And we all know that, according to that act you just quoted, there are 3 conditions that need to be met in order to be labeled as a currency manipulator. China only met 1. And as a matter of fact, in previous reports, consecutive previous reports from the Department of Treasury, China was never labeled as a currency manipulator at all. So, this is unwarranted. And I want to keep also in mind that I think other than just placing some more pressure on the U.S.-China trade negotiation, there's actually another agenda, in my opinion, from President Trump. That is to say that he has this contract, so-called contract with American voters, that once he came into office, he will put China as a currency manipulator status. That's what he promised to American voters. And we all know that President Trump is really fixated on meeting every one of his campaign promises, and this one being very conveniently met as one. So I think all these things, put them together, and it's sort of expedient policy for the United States to label China as a currency manipulator. But I agree with the Professor Ravi that there's not much substance in this, and I don't think that the Trump administration is actually successful in putting some pressure on the negotiations at all. It's just a very symbolic thing, and it came as a symbolic thing and it went out as a symbolic thing.
So as I mentioned, there are 3 criteria that the country that has to have a significant trade surplus with the United States. There must be a current account surplus and persistent one-sided intervention in foreign exchange market. Right. John, as you said, China actually only meet the first criteria, but it seems that it didn't prevent the United States Treasury Department last year from putting this label onto China. Exactly how do you explain that? I mean, even a lot of people in the United States are asking, if you have 3 criteria, then you have to look whether these meet the criteria, then you can justify your decision. Otherwise, why do you make such a decision? Professor Ramamurti, was this decision a justifiable one in the first place?
I think based on the criteria, it wasn't, certainly at this juncture. Historically, there were times when China had a very large current account surplus, as much as 10% of GDP, for instance, in 2007. At that point, you could have argued that the yuan should have appreciated more. But to do that in 2019, I think it was a political decision. And we have seen that the administration is able to bend some of the provisions of these laws to suit its convenience. It's done so in other fronts with other trading partners. And this is just another example of that. And as Professor mentioned, this is a political campaign promise, and this campaign promise has been met. Therefore, I think they are ready to move on and say we have already achieved this aspect of the campaign promise.
This is astonishing. To me, this is astonishing. This is a flagrant loss or erosion to the credibility of any government when they set out a clear set of criteria, and then they just go about and do whatever they want, depending on the political needs of the time. This is, to me, this is incredible. This is not very American, Professor Ramamurti.
Well, the Treasury Secretary had to go along with it, but these are political appointments in the U.S., and President Trump particularly has his cabinet very much aligned with whatever his views are, and they are often trying to guess what he's going to say or what he's going to do, and then have to adjust accordingly. So I'm sure there was some of that going on as well in this situation.
According to a former senior Treasury official, Mark Sobel, he also said, and I quote from this report on the New York Times, that China was errantly designated at a moment of presidential pick. It should never have happened in the first place. China manages but does not manipulate its currency. So it seems to be quite clear, and yet, when this label is put there, China can't really do anything besides arguing, besides saying, hey, we don't manipulate our... But the news is out there, it's like the scarlet letter that you already wear. John, is it a fair metaphor that I'm making here?
I think so. Well, no, remember that Secretary Mnuchin has never come up with a very satisfactory answer when it comes to trying to answer your question you raised. Why is it China was labeled as a currency manipulator at this moment, right? And there's actually a report early on, after Trump came to power, immediately he wants to do this, and he was persuaded of by Secretary Mnuchin. Now, at the time it was imposed, it was described as an errant moment of a peak. So, this is very typical of the Trump style of doing things. He wants to get things done. He wants to get things done his own way, and his subordinates just, trying to justify that. I'm pretty sure there are people in the Department of Treasury will come up with some kind of a legalistic argument, say, well, we didn't technically violate these 3 requirements, and I'm pretty sure these lawyers can come up with kind of a solution. But this is a moot point, though. I mean, it's clearly a political point that doesn't serve much purpose, other than maybe he can have one more thing to brag about his delivering his campaign promises.
Yeah, but I think this is going beyond a little bit beyond the limit, right? When you do this on a very often regular basis, then how can someone deal with a government like that?
Well, I mean, if you put it this way, there's not much things that this Trump administration can lose anymore. I mean, it has done a lot of things in the past that has, in my opinion, damaged the United States' credibility in the international community all along. Ever since 2017 he came to power. What else can he do? I mean, he cannot do much more damage. This is
That's pretty sad. Let's look ahead. Let's look ahead, Professor Ramamurti. Now, as you mentioned, this label is temporarily off, but during the next phase of negotiations, for instance, what could be done to it? What kind of use could it be put again in order to put pressure on China? Would you foresee that kind of possibility?
I don't think this is going to come up again. First, because China is no longer enjoying the kind of trade current account surplus that it enjoyed in the past. I think right now we're looking at current account surplus of maybe 0.5% of GDP, and some expect it will turn into a negative in the coming year. So I don't think this will per se be an issue, and all of the other issues can be dealt with by President Trump with the levers that are already provided under existing trade laws, and I don't think this issue is going to come up in the future. Okay,
John, your imagination here?
Well, that I agree. I think look at the currency situation right now. I think actually it's trading at 6.8, around 6.8 right now, and I expect that RMB will probably continue to appreciate a little bit more after we sign this trade agreement in the next few hours. I think the trend of RMB depreciation has already gone. I think at least in the next few months, probably towards the end of the 2020, we're going to be in a much stronger RMB territory.
Mm-hmm. It also mentioned that China is likely to publish relevant information in terms of its financial for instance, foreign exchange issues, including currency. So how important is that a provision in the trade deal? John, what is your take?
Well, I think what this sentence was referring to is probably referring to the mechanism that RMB is set. We know that the RMB is set with a basket of currencies, but the central bank here in China has never really disclosed the formula, the exact formula. What are the currencies? What are the weights in these currencies? We don't know that yet. But based on empirical analysis that has been done in the past, we know that a very large weight in that basket of currencies is the US dollar. I think what this statement is referring to is perhaps disclosing that formula, telling people, what are the weights of these currencies, how the exchange rate was set by the central bank. Probably is referring to that point.
Okay. We're going to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Ravi Ramamurti, Director of the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University, and Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics here in Beijing.